Unit 1, Cognitive Psychology. Presentation 1, The Nature of Memory. Duration. There are many ways to consider the nature of memory. One of them is to distinguish between short and long-term memories.
Psychologists use three key concepts to distinguish between short and long-term memory. These are duration, capacity, and encoding. We will begin with the concept of duration.
This is an obvious place to start because short-term memory lasts for a short time and long-term memory lasts for a long time. Duration is a measure of how long a memory lasts before it is no longer available. There is no precise difference between the duration of a short and long-term memory. Basically, short-term memory is measured in seconds and minutes, whereas when we think of long-term memory, we're usually thinking of hours, days, and years.
What have research studies shown us about the duration of short-term memory?
Husband and wife researchers Margaret and Lloyd Peterson conducted a classic study in the 1950s. They recruited 24 students for the study, and each took part in several trials. In each trial, a student was given a consonant syllable to be remembered, such as XBH, 3 letters, all consonants. The student was also given a 3-digit number and was asked to count backwards from that number until told to stop. At this point, they had to recall the consonant syllable.
The reason for counting backwards was to prevent the student rehearsing the syllable they had to remember.
Each student repeated this task 8 times. On each occasion, there was a different retention interval, so sometimes they were stopped after 3 seconds before having to recall, sometimes after 6 seconds, and so on, all the way up to 18 seconds.
What did Peterson and Peterson find?
They found that the students could remember about 90% of the consonant syllables correctly when there was only a 3-second interval, but this dropped to about 20% after 9 seconds, and to as little as 2% when there was an 18-second interval.
This suggests that short-term memory has a duration of less than 18 seconds if verbal rehearsal is prevented. In fact, most information had disappeared within a few seconds, and this suggests that short-term memory has a very, very short duration indeed. Unless, of course, we repeat something over and over again.
There have been some criticisms of this study. The first criticism relates to the fact that the stimulus material in Peterson and Peterson's study was artificial. Trying to memorize consonant syllables does not truly reflect most real-life memory activities, where what we are trying to remember is meaningful. So we might say that this study lacked ecological validity. However, we do sometimes try to remember fairly meaningless things, such as phone numbers, so the study's not totally irrelevant.
A second criticism relates to internal validity. Were the researchers actually testing what they intended to test? They intended to test duration of short-term memory, but it could be that what was actually happening was displacement. They were counting the numbers in their short-term memories, and this displaced the syllables to be remembered. Therefore, the forgetting was likely to be due to displacement rather than some kind of spontaneous decay of the information to be remembered. So Peterson and Peterson weren't exactly measuring the duration of short-term memory.
The final criticism is that more recent research has found that short-term memory actually has a slightly longer duration than the Petersons suggested. It's still measured in seconds, but it's longer than the 18 seconds suggested by Peterson and Peterson. In the 1990s, Nairn found that items could still be accurately recalled after as long as 96 seconds. Therefore, it seems that information remains for quite a while in short-term memory unless other material replaces or overwrites it.
What have research studies shown us about the duration of long-term memory? Let's look at 2 studies, a lab experiment and a natural experiment.
In the lab experiment, Shepard showed 12 participants 612 memorable pictures, one at a time. 4 participants were then retested after 2 hours. This time they were shown 68 pairs of pictures, one from the original series and a new picture. They were close to 100% accurate in identifying the picture they had seen before. Another 4 participants were retested after 7 days and their recall was about 90%. The final 4 participants were tested after 4 months and identified about 60% of the pictures correctly.
What can we conclude from this study?
The results clearly demonstrate that long-term memory tails off over time if information is not rehearsed and if it isn't very meaningful to the participants.
And what do the results of the natural experiment show us, where the information to be remembered was more meaningful?
In this American study, Barick and his co-researchers used photographs in high school yearbooks. They asked people of various ages to put names to the faces from their high school yearbook and found that even after 48 years, people were about 70% accurate. In this case, the material to be remembered was more meaningful to the participants than in Shepard's study, and this presumably explains why the duration of long-term memories was better.
However, there are a few critical points to consider regarding these 2 studies. First of all, both of these studies concern recognition memory. It is always easier to recognize something rather than recall it when there are no clues. So, these studies only tell us about one kind of memory, that is, recognition rather than recall.
A second criticism is we actually don't know in either of these studies to what extent people might have rehearsed the information. For example, in the yearbook study, some participants might actually have looked at the yearbooks regularly, and that's why their recognition was so good. In this case, rehearsal is acting as an extraneous variable.